Yeah. Can I be seen and heard?
Yes, you can be seen and heard.
Amazing. Okay. POI me in the chat. I'll probably take closing position around the 15 minutes. Three, two, one. The first thing I want to do is be exceptionally clear about what countries we are talking about. These are not moderate or left-wing countries. These are extremely far-right countries, and obviously countries that largely build their legitimacy around the idea of religious narratives. Notably, these can't be fiscally conservative countries, but are socially liberal ones, because obviously the movement would have probably succeeded in these areas already. So this is about countries that often use religious rhetoric to demonize LGBTQ individuals or use it as the idea of them being against the local family unit. The fact that they often are just unnatural or painting them as the devil is often the way that these governments interact, often have harsh persecutory policies on the average individual within these places. Given this, we have three arguments for you. First, on why it's likely the case that this is better for your own individual safety. Secondly, why we get better movement building. And finally, the long-term goals of the movement. First argument, and this is the most important argument in the debate, is why this is better for the safety and general life of LGBTQ individuals. I want to first be exceptionally clear on the comparative. Opposition must defend more people coming out and often in unsafe situations for three specific reasons. First, the movement actively encourages people to come out and express their identity, even though the government is relatively right wing. That is, that the media that they send to you is often that it won't be as bad as you think, that leaving your family is fine, that it's okay if you come out, even if you have a negative reception on their side of the house. This is a trusted source on their side of the house, so it is likely the case that people come out. Secondly, many of the people that they're talking about are relatively young, impressionable individuals and look to the movement as a source of authority. So at that point, any messaging by the movement is incredibly important and likely to be quite believed. So a ton of individuals come out on their side of the house. I want to now paint what the far right government looks like and why it is likely the case that this is particularly harmful on their side of the house. Look, panel, within their world, far right governments often have actively inflammatory rhetoric and openly discriminatory policies towards the average LGBTQ individuals. This looks like places like Saudi Arabia literally not recognizing you. It looks like Pakistan actively not having any rights for things like gay marriage and cracking down on things like protests with significant amounts of pressure. It looks like actively not giving you any form of tax rights, recognizing your legal status, and in many cases persecuting you like Uganda. We would also posit that the average person in these countries tends to be relatively homophobic. That's because that's the environment they've been indoctrinated into. And even if they were liberal in the past, the fact that many of them support this government means that the latent, implicit homophobia that they have is often activated. Notably, these people are often religious and follow the leader that they've elected in many cases to engage in significant amounts of discrimination on their side of the house. The impact of this when you are out is twofold. The first and most obvious one is literal physical safety. We would posit that when people are caught engaging in LGBTQ actions, when they are dressed as a female, as a man, when in many cases they are carrying out genuine, authentic expressions of their identity, they fear for their physical safety. It is just true that you are likely to often get harassed in the streets, that it is likely the case that you face significant microaggressions, but in the worst cases, you might literally be physically assaulted way more on their side of the house. The second level to this, though, is just the economic consequences you face. Often, it is much harder to get a job on their side of the house. That is to say that when you have your name as being different than your what you look like, when it is the case that you dress as a man, in many, many cases, those forms of expression of identity just uniquely mean that on their side of the house, employers don't want to hire you and implicitly cut you out in the hiring process. This means you're less likely to have economic power on their side of the house, and therefore it is just true that in their world, it's powerful. What's the comparative? It is hard to hide your identity and it is hard for your authenticity. But we would posit that on our side of the house, obviously you can hide it by often dressing as a gender you assign, by making it so that you have things like lavender marriages like China to get people off your back. The fact that you can often engage in literally not being out completely to a number of people means that you can often hide your identity fairly well. Also, it is true that like most people haven't raised trade households, so you can probably disguise this to a fairly large extent. I want to weigh this against opposition's claim, which is going to be that being out is important and being authentic is important. Firstly, we would posit that you still have access to queer spaces to some extent on our side of the house. That is to say that when the movement exists and often people exist on a local level, you can interact with queer individuals in secret meetups through things like Grindr, which means you can still access numbers of these places. Secondly, there are small liberal bubbles that you can still access, which consist of people like your friends. So you can still talk to them about these issues rather than going out and protesting. Notably, the comparative on our side then is that you can still access the vast majority of benefits, which is what the average person needs, versus going out and exposing your identity to the world. Second claim, why do we get better
POI.
movement building on our side? Yeah, go for it.
Okay. What does it then mean to be coming out if your friends
Coming
and
out
in the
means
grinder for you?
no, you can talk to your closest friends. You're not coming out to the vast majority of people. You're not dressing up in the sense of the identity you actually care about. This is some small numbers of people who are engaging in Grindr. Obviously, this isn't about coming out to your parents and others, which is your comparative. You're actively encouraged to express your identity. Second claim, why do we get better movement building and what is the long term on our side of the house? There are two things that I want to talk about. First, why are we likely to get better change on our side of the house? I want to first just explain why, on their side of the house, the kind of change they advocate for is ineffective. Notably, when you are out, the kind of change that you must advocate for is often related to your identity, the acceptance of the average LGBTQ person. It looks like protesting for things like gay marriage, etc., and political acceptance. What is the comparative? On our side of the house, because you are no longer focusing on identity, we would posit what you focus on is often things like LGBTQ shelters and often talking about basic therapy. You do not need to discuss identity and can often send links to places like this is the homeless shelter that you can go to in the event that you are accidentally found out. That this is where we have networking support events that are often quite hidden. This means that on a comparative, the kind of change that we get is focused on a much more granular level and on the ground level as compared to trying to lobby politicians who wouldn't be convinced. Finally, let's chat about the long term of the movement. There are two possible governments that exist. First is places like Hungary, which were liberal but then turned right wing. I want to win on this first because, look, this government will get done in a few years, and I think waiting is the best option in preserving your resources. Notably, if you protest at this time, if you actively come out, you are likely to be harmed. And the government often cracks down on you, which means you experience a significant amount of backlash. You see lots of people going out and actively beating you up on the streets, for example, or not giving you jobs. But when a left-wing government comes eventually, having saved your resources, you have significantly more people in the movement and more people who are not afraid to protest. So it is likely the case we get better change in the long term within this. In Pakistan and others, Pan-African you're just not going to get change. Glee and euphoria are better mechanisms for change than you protesting. Proud to propose.
I would like to thank that speaker for that fantastic speech. And just to confirm, does opening opposition consent to being recorded? Because I don't think I gathered that at the beginning.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, lovely. In that case, I would like to once again thank the PM for that fantastic speech, and to open the case for side opposition, I would like to invite LO to the floor. Here.
Perfect. I'll take POIs verbally, so please just interrupt. I will, I don't know who I'll take one from. It'll be a mystery. I want to start by pushing back against opening government's characterization of far-right regimes because I think it's firstly incredibly uncharitable, but secondly incredibly unrealistic. I want to first give you a bunch of examples of far-right regimes that are like economically quite far-right, but that actually don't care all that much about gay rights. Like look, for example, at many of the regimes in South America, people like Javier Milei, who's aggressively, cutting government services, cutting taxes, by all measures like described as a far-right populist, but truthfully does not really care all that much about social issues. People like Bolsonaro in Brazil, even places like Hungary and Poland that OG wants to talk about. Like, sure, obviously the government has been less receptive to gay rights. In Poland, there have even been some pushes back against things like gay marriage, but I think you're not putting gay people in jail. It's still like constitutionally illegal to fire them from their jobs for being gay. I think they're still members of the European Union and there are lots of protections in place to prevent these kinds of things. And I think there are even lots of examples of far-right regimes that more recently have mobilized aspects of the LGBTQ movement to support them. So look at Marine Le Pen in France, for example, who actively used the narrative that like immigrants that have different social ideas are going to come into our country and like ruin gay rights for people. She was actually able to tap into certain aspects of the LGBTQ movement. And obviously this isn't universal. We acknowledge that there are some countries in which the government is actively taking a stance against LGBTQ issues, but I think that these are generally the most extreme cases of the far-right regimes, and opening government needs to contend with these. The second thing I'll characterize to you, though, is we think even in the regimes where, like, yes, they take an active stance against gay rights, I think this is generally not an enormous priority to them. And there are a few reasons for this. Firstly, I think, like, unlike other types of social movements or activists, like, even the feminist movement, for example, if you want to talk about really hardcore religious countries where there aren't very many rights for minorities, I think generally the LGBTQ movement isn't a particularly large threat. It's a relatively small number of people. They're often relatively well educated, relatively well integrated in society with jobs and families and stuff like this. And usually the demands that they're making of the government aren't for them to radically change aspects of their policy. It's generally just to like live and let live, which is easier to deal with. The second thing, though, is it's actually quite hard and expensive to like crack down on every single person that comes out as gay in your country. I think a lot of the time the most regressive regimes are also some of the ones that have the least resources available to do things like this in places like Afghanistan, or certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where you actually have pretty limited government resources, and they're not going to be able to come into everyone's town, everyone's house, figure out who's gay, and put all of them in jail because that's really expensive. Finally, though, I think there's actually pretty significant international pressure not to hugely crack down on the local LGBTQ population, which again, I think encourages regimes, even if on paper they oppose LGBTQ rights, not to put this into too much effect in practice because they're worried about things like Western sanctions, because this is a very heavily politicized issue that places like the US, like the European Union, like Australia, like Canada care quite a lot about. Finally, though, I think that in the absolute worst cases where like you absolutely know that you're immediately getting fired from your job, or your family's going to disown you, or you're going to get thrown in jail or deported or whatever, it's unlikely that people follow the advice of the movement and come out. I think, sure, people are impressionable, but they generally do care about self-preservation. They're not that stupid. We think that the cases in which you come out because the movement gives you this advice is likely where you do face some social backlash. Maybe you have to have some difficult conversations with your friends and family. Maybe you now don't get that promotion at work, but you probably outright don't get fired. I think it's probably the more likely case where this applies. Having given you all that framing then, two arguments, firstly on just the social change you're likely to get, and secondly on the harms that accrue to you from not being open about your identity. Because I don't think this is a dichotomy where either you're harmed on government or you're totally safe on opposition. I think there are actually pretty significant harms on both sides, and we're going to explain why our harms outweigh the OG ones. So firstly, on social change, I think that when you're open about your identity, you are able to change a lot of people's perspectives on things like LGBTQ issues. You're able to talk to your friends, you're able to talk to your family, and I think change their perspectives, because these are generally people that already care about you as a person, that are likely to then be receptive to the things that you tell them by virtue of caring about you directly. You're probably the most effective person to ever change their mind. And I think when you're able to talk to them, you can encourage them. Maybe they're not going to, go show up to the Pride Parade with you tomorrow, but I think you can generally encourage them to be a lot more receptive towards queer people and less likely to do things like commit the kinds of microaggressions that OG talks about. And so I think this is a pretty effective mechanism that can then manifest an electoral change through things like voting or protesting or petitions, whatever. Secondly, though, I think that when you just behave openly in a queer way, I think that this actually helps to normalize and humanize queer people for people around you, right? And so when you see a gay couple walking down the street and looking very normal and eating ice cream like any other couple that you might see, I think that this helps to generally shift people's perception of what queer people are like. And especially in a regime where they've maybe been raised with the belief that they're incredibly different from us, they behave in these crazy ways, I think when you see these changes, I think this helps to undermine those stereotypes, change the perception. I think also, though, it's easier to form a movement and create solidarity because you can find other queer people like you a lot more easily than you could in like an underground gay bar or on Grindr, which OG seems to think is the counterfactual. And this makes it easy, like, for you on a personal level to find people that you can relate to and talk about your experience with. But on a societal level, I think it's easier to collectivize, to plan the kinds of actions that are effective at actually getting change, things like protesting, voting, strikes, etc. And finally, I think you're more likely to create art and media that can change people's minds when you're open about your identity. You can write a newspaper article or a book or a poem about what it's like to have that experience of coming out in a society that's not super receptive to that. I think you reach a much wider audience, which again gradually changes hearts and minds. And I think actually that the case of like countries that used to be quite liberal and are now going far right is actually a pretty excellent example of cases where this kind of protest matters. Places like Hungary that do have democratic institutions that are responsive to popular demands are the places where you probably are most effective at protesting, at coming out openly, at changing people's minds, because people are already somewhat predisposed to think this. I think you are likely the change that results in that government switch. Finally, though, I think there are enormous harms that come from just not being able to be open about your identity. I think you have to hide your relationship, which puts a lot of stress on your relationship with your partner, but it also means it's sad, it's scary not to be able to share this with your family and your friends, to have to hide this every day when you go to work, not to be able to get an apartment together, not to be able to walk down the street holding hands with the person that you love. All of this is pretty significant. And I think furthermore, it's harder for you to find other people to relate to about your experience, to find people even to date in the first place. I think you likely experience a lot of exogenous pressure to enter a more conventional relationship if you don't have the ability to point to a reason why you're not doing that, all of which I think is a huge psychological harm.
I would like to thank the speaker for the fantastic speech. And to continue the case for state government, I would like to invite PPM to the floor. You're here.
Hello, can I confirm I'm audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Okay, amazing. POIs by voice, I repeat, POIs verbally. I am not looking at the chat. I will take a POI from CO. So yeah, just shout it out whenever. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Let's be charitable and presume that Ops' characterization of these kinds of nations are correct. We are better in movement building for 4 specific reasons. The first reason is because the left-wing governments are anyways going to come to power in opposition scenario. There's no guarantee that Marine Le Pen or Javier or Bolsonaro is going to remain in change. No, this is why Bolsonaro was followed by Lula da Silva. This is why Javier Milei has got his historically very low popularity ratings. And the reason why it's often likely you get right-wing, like left-wing governments come to power is because many people may believe in left-wing economic policies. It's because often you have 2 opposition parties who have their own media that are constantly like fighting or pushing back against each other, which means there is a large group of moderates who sometimes believe in right-wing policies, sometimes believe in left-wing policies, which means there often is a pendulum effect where they would switch back as swing voters from right-wing governments to left-wing governments. In these instances, side opposition is hoping for 4 years more of marginal additional change and risk a significant amount of personal harm to a lot of these individuals. Because to be clear here, the fact that you have to wait another 4 years to come out for movement building isn't do very much for the movement, right? It still is a right-wing government, and often they have come to power explicitly by polarizing the left wing, by saying that they're horrible, evil people you ought demonize. So it's not clear you can make that change. What's far more likely is you activate or visit upon yourself a lot more distinct harms. For example, microaggressions from a lot of right-wing or more conservative individuals who did vote for the far-right party on the basis of immigration in many instances, right? Like a distinct percentage of white people who are also racist against Muslims probably are also conservative Catholics in many instances. I think this is empirically true, which means in many instances, they may still have microaggressions against you. They may still dislike you in many instances or throw you a problematic or bad comment. And often, crucially, if inside opposition, you want to go and mobilize a public change, police officers can come and beat you on the street or throw tear gas at you. Why do all this? Instead, just wait for 4 more years, wait for the left-wing government to come to power, and then you can actively promote a huge number of pro-LGBT change anyways. So what happens on their side is those people, if not running the risk of getting to jail, face a lot more microaggressions, face a lot more active hostility from a lot of individuals, from the government, crucially, who may send a police officer after them, from a politician who says, I will not pass your bill under any cost because of the government we are under at. Those people get demoralized and don't remain part of your movement 4 years later, as compared to on our side, where they're happy to remain quiet, but 4 years later, they're going to be able to promote active change on our side. Secondly, our for sort of change is far more certain than side opposition. Look at the link chain op needs to get. They need to prove that the queer movement, numerically a small number of people in most nations, including liberal ones definitionally, are people who are large enough to create mass public protests, are able to get politicians to make change, and the policy change doesn't get reversed in the next 3 or 4 years anyways. It's very uncertain that even if they get a larger movement, the movement is going to lead to significant change. But our harm on personal safety or not feeling really terrible about yourself anytime somebody on outside in society hates you, that is far, far more important. Third piece of way, it often getting a job in many instances is the prerequisite anyways. No, thank you. And that's because in many of it, like you often risk in many conservative areas, for example, like conservative rural Kentucky or Mississippi, even within liberal nations, you risk a far more backlash, right? Anytime you try and openly come out as queer. And crucially, this is important here, the way you come out is often perceived as stereotypical. So you may because often a person who's coming out as queer for the first time wants to be a bit performative. They want to not suppress any form of their identity. And so they often are stereotypical, they're often perceived as stereotypical gay in many ways possible. So coloring their hair, the color in a different color, or wearing a mohawk, or in some instances wearing a really cute crop top as a boy or something like that, right? But so you want to have your maximum amount of self-expression, and opposition validates that with a specific queer movement they talk about. But that often means that you also risk far more backlash in many instances. You cannot break the stereotype as side opposition wants to talk about. You're far more likely to invite microaggressions because you're perceived as different, as weird, or as strange as compared to any random person who you may meet on the street anyways, right? But I want to be less charitable now, right? You are going to come out to your closest friends and families anyways. This motion is about publicly or openly expressing your identity. If they are people whom you deeply love and deeply trust, you are often going to be happy to express your identity to those individuals by trusting them, right? All this motion will suggest is that you don't openly express it any time you're out onto the street in many instances. But secondly, I don't think they acknowledge the fact that for many people in conservative nations like the UAE where I am at, gay people aren't like always just trying to kill themselves. I'm so sorry to say this. Like, I think they're often able to live a life by just finding a support group, finding things like Grindr subtly, and finding expression in those identities. They're not always going to be happy, but I think opposition vastly oversees the harms of anxiety. So in liberal nations, we're still very clearly winning. But now I want to talk about conservative nations because Gov is very, very like sneaky in the way they go about this, right? Look, no. First of all, on far-right regimes, they say, what exactly is a right-wing government? 3 problems with this. 1, many of the examples they point out are actively anti-LGBT. Have you heard any of Bolsonaro's statements or his policies that he's put out over there? Javier Milei has explicitly come out as anti-LGBTQ side of opposition. Just because you are white people who don't understand South America doesn't mean anyone else doesn't. But secondly, even if this is true, right? So let's say we're talking about the instances such as Europe or something that Op wants to talk about, like Marine Le Pen. Like, this is such a tiny group of people, right? Because in those instances, like most nations that are already that care about economically that are economically right-wing are already socially liberal, which means the movement is not going to act in this way, right? For example, even if the movement propagates that, you, for example, shouldn't always come out, people on the ground will still come out because they'd say, you know what, my regime is like perfectly pro-LGBTQ. Marine Le Pen actively has like a woman or something like that as a partner. And so it's not going to have a big delta in those instances because people will not believe the LGBT narrative in those ways. Where the narrative has far more delta is in the vast majority of instances, in more conservative regions anyways. Before I win on this group that is quite unresponded to closing opposition.
Yeah, so you say that like there's essentially a guarantee, right, that like left-wing policies will eventually come in and all the harms will be resolved, right? Like if we are uncharitable in terms of the sense where like this doesn't end up happening, what's like how will people in the queer movement react? Wouldn't support go down, etc.?
So well, I mean, I think the point is I don't care about this because it's not going to happen. You need to prove to me why, like, the United States is always going to be right-wing for the next 50 years, why Europe is always going to be right-wing for the next 40 years, why South America is. I think the average intelligent voter knows you would be lying out of your pants if that's the case. Okay, so the point I want to make here, right, is this. The scenarios that Op talk about, even if they are the minority, right, even if, say, the government is not right-wing, people are often right-wing. And this is for all of these reasons and how the religion often is like people have deeply strong religious beliefs that often are anti-LGBT. People have strong traditional tendencies. So even if, for example, people don't come out as LGBT, right, you hate the movement a lot more. You perceive the movement as a bad thing because you say, why are you having these people come out? And that's what invites a lot of religious backlash. That's what gets you fired in many instances anyways. And the impact of this is far more important in 2 ways. 1, these are the most vulnerable groups of individuals. Even if there's no change in any other group, these are the people whom we always ought to protect the most. And 2, the harms are far more intense. Like seeing violence visited upon you, going to jail possibly seems far more important than opposition. Propose.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fantastic speech. And to conclude the top half of this debate, I would like to invite Deputy Leader of the Opposition to the floor. Here, here.
Okay, just give me 1 second. All right, 3, 2, 1. Panel, when you come out, it is probably going to be easier for you to organize, and it is also significantly harder to enforce when more people organize collectively for the issues that you care about. I think that this still applies to far right governments, and I think that this actually applies even more so in governments that, in the way OG characterizes, that are extremely far right. Firstly, I think Anais already kills you and recharacterizes this debate by telling you that these are probably not going to realistically be countries such as Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan who are super far right, but these are mainly like based on religion. These are far right governments that are purely based on religion who persecute on those extremist ideals. But secondly, I think it is more true that the people who voted these far right governments in, and at least the democratic uh, populist version of the far right. So we look at Brazil, Argentina, or like Poland. In those places, people probably care a lot more about like proximate issues. People voted those in because the economy was shit. They cared a lot. They cared a lot more about their country's outlook in terms of global relations. They felt that their country was not doing very well in terms of those particular issues, which is why they actually voted those governments in. I don't think the people on the ground who voted those governments in cared nearly as much about queer issues, or at least, or at least to the extent that it would matter that the government would actively try to persecute these people, because it does take a lot of energy, it does take a lot of money, and it does take a lot of time for these governments to prove to me that these governments are then actually going to do that. A few responses here. Firstly, because this is incredibly exhausting for these governments to go after the gays, this is money and manpower that can be used towards other issues people actually care about. So if your government is actively going after trans people, but this money can then just be used towards like, I don't know, like actual issues that the populist regimes like care about. I don't know, like fixing the economy. I think those people are going to uh, those people would care about it significantly more. That is still voted you in for, then it looks bad for your government. I think it is unlikely that they're actually to persecute you because of that. Secondly, the people, yeah, again, the people that voted for these governments care more about these proximate issues, and so they appeal to people's emotions. I think it's unlikely. Thirdly, their stuff on like waiting for the left wing governments is unlikely. Why? They kind of never explain this. They just tell you that, oh, we'll just wait for the left wing government. Explain to me why the U.S. will never be right left wing again in the next 50 years. I think this is untrue. A few reasons why. Firstly, again, as I said, that these are populist governments that appeal to emotions. I think that the leaders of these countries are going to actively seek out these kinds of emotions from the far right. But secondly, I think it's unclear to me to just wait on the chances of you going back to the left wing. And thirdly, if you don't advocate right now, it might make it even worse because then these issues are not like publicly shown, and so it means that it means that you're unlikely to actually be able to get it means that you're unlikely to actually be able to get left wing governments in the first place, because the actual issues that the left cares about are not going to be known publicly if you don't actively and collectively organize. Finally, on the stuff about inviting microaggressions. Firstly, I think that people in like more liberal countries probably don't like care about these things nearly as much. I think the average person is not going to take their time out of their day to be annoyed. Like at most, like if you're dressing in a certain way that people don't like, at most you'll probably get some weird looks, but it's not going to be like active persecution towards you or active harms towards you. But secondly, I think that in things like when it comes to your jobs and stuff, I think that if that people come out, even if they had some, when it comes to your jobs, I think that most people probably aren't going to go to that extent to fire someone based off their job or based off their identity just because they feel that they are gay, even in these countries. I think there are significantly more factors that jobs probably care about. So if the people that come out, even if they had some encouragement from the movement, actively made this choice and then accept this harm, we'd rather they get hurt than the closeted queer people that get persecuted if nothing actually changes from the status quo. Finally, then movement the movement encourages people to come out. So what they said. So the response to this is basically if more people come out, it becomes easier to organize and a lot harder to enforce. Simply because when you actively engage as part of your community, that is to say that if you come out and publicly express who you are as a person now, this isn't just like your close friends. I think that what they are talking about how you can just go on Grinder is incredibly unlikely, because Grinder and these kinds of apps are like opening these forums is incredibly, like, if you are to hide your identity, this is not the best way to hide your identity. I don't think this is what hiding your identity actually looks like. I think hiding your identity probably looks like, we think that it is fair that they characterize it as only telling it to your close friends, but it probably means that you're not telling it to anybody else. Nobody else knows this. Even if you were going onto an app, you probably fear this kind of, if you're actively choosing to hide your identity, you fear that someone's going to find out. This looks like putting your profile out on Grinder and someone finding out and then like actually telling people that this person is gay. Anyway, why are then the active harms of not being why are then the active harms of hiding a lot worse? So the first thing is that relationships being closed is incredibly harmful. You can't be open about your relationship and you're constantly living in secret. In meeting up, you're probably doing things like meeting up in sketchy places, trying to hide from your family and others. I'll take a POI at this point if there are any. Okay, none. Anyway,
The
so
issue
this
with
is
your case, the issue with your case is doesn't deal with the reality of people on the ground who are often far right wing. Marie Le Pen may not care about LGBTQ issues, but these often overlap with other right wing issues like fiscal people who are very religious and therefore commit microaggressions to individuals on the ground.
okay. I don't think this engages with the fact that if you do publicly express yourself, it's easier to actually create community groups, because I think this kind of persecution, if it is a far right government in a conservative area, exists either way. This is symmetric. You're going to get persecuted anyway, and so I think it is makes it incredibly difficult. Like if you do publicly express it and you are able to create these communities, because now it's easier for you to find people who are queer. It's easier for you to organize and collectively action towards policies that you care about. It makes it far harder for these people to enact or to act upon these kinds of aggressions towards you, right? Because now you have more of your community coming out and more collective action being taken place. Okay, secondly, then your relationships are then also likely to be worse because you don't have the same types of support groups as you would have in on our side of the house, because these support groups will only presumably exist when more people come out. If only your close friends or very very few people know, you're not likely to get these support groups, simply because not a lot of people have information about you. I think people are
Time.
generally a lot more empathetic and are going to care about these issues. It's okay. With that said, proud to oppose.
I would like to thank that speaker for that fantastic speech. And to open the second half of this debate, I would like to invite member of government to the floor to hear.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are audible and visible.
Nice. Okay, I'm just gonna set up a stopwatch and then I'll start in a sec. I'll take POIs through chat. The problem with opening half is a misunderstanding of the demographics of these queer movements, where OG's mistake is assuming people are so stupid as to not be able to pick and choose the instances where they can come out because the movement is too strong. Where I think opening opposition fairly and correctly points out that if it is that bad and if them coming out constitutes attacks on their own personal self, then obviously they won't do it. This observation is important because one, It explains why security isn't the most important issue, because regardless, there are incentives for individuals to want to avoid harms against themselves by choosing to not opt in, even if the movement tells them. But the second reason why this observation is important is because it showcases the spectrum of people in these movements. That is, that regardless of what happens, there are going to be some amount of people who will not come out regardless of whether or not the movement encourages them, and some people who will. What we'll do at Closing Government is to take the trade-off and explain why it's worth it. Why is it that individuals who remain closeted under their regardless are the most important individuals, and on their side you tend the movement towards one that no longer caters to these people in a significant extent and one that is actively harmful to their own needs? The first thing that I want to note is why these individuals are considerably more important than other individuals who will choose to come out via this encouragement. The first is that the spectrum of people who are poor and cannot be able and cannot opt out of their lived experiences, cannot move out to other countries or be able to insulate themselves from their harms, means that the people who are afraid to come out are likely individuals who don't have as much financial capital, are the most scared within these movements, and the least secure about their own identities with regard to how they perceive themselves. They feel the most trapped and feel the greatest strain. So both by likely one, the amount of individuals who will probably be afraid to do this is likely going to be a lot in far-right in democracies or even far-right institutions where they're afraid to do so because that fear magnifies in their heads. It's also the case that this is the most severe impact and actor in the debate, which is why you ought cater to them. Therefore, the true delta and contribution from Closing Government is where the movement caters to these people more. And here are 3 reasons why. The first thing that I want to note is why this is important. This is important insofar as their ability to be able to deal with a lot of the crippling doubt that is attached to being alone, being closeted, is oftentimes not restricted to friends, because in the vast majority of instances, these people are isolated from those communities because these things are often hard to come by. But in the vast majority of instances, it's things that are facilitated by the movement itself. There are 3 reasons why this becomes far harder under their side. The first thing that I want to note is that the public demand of members, especially the ones that they specifically want to cater to, affects the very things that the movement do themselves. I.e., if a larger majority of the movement chooses to come out, then they have to shape the movement towards the interests of a specific demographic of people, which clearly aren't closeted people in the first place. But secondly, internally and cognitively, it's whether or not closeted individuals can associate themselves with the movement if more people come out as a result. Because note, what you're doing is encouraging every single person, regardless of their own intuitions and lived realities, to come out. What you are saying is that if you do not come out, you obviously have to create a disincentive insofar as the mechanisms for social conditioning and trying to convince people to do something are relatively the same. So that means changing the movement's goals and priorities away from mere acceptance, but becoming more liberal and more forward by virtue of it. It's explaining that in the vast majority of instances, as a prerequisite towards being able to be acknowledged and understood by the movement, you must consider yourself as out and be able to come out in that instance. So the movement loses out through its limited money and considering opportunity costs on doing things that could be beneficial for these people in the first place. So instead of spending limited time and money towards catering to these individuals, like paying for mental health breaks or paying for individuals to have better support systems within the movement in the instance in which they don't have friends, or being able to organize things like small underground gatherings as a means to be able to ensure that these people do have lived realities outside of their closeted instances. The fact that the movement actively takes a stance against a very specific type of queer person that doesn't want to come out at this instance means that they lose out on a lot of those benefits. In short, these people find it far harder to cope within these instances, which means closeted people have it worse, which for all the reasons we've already talked about is the most important thing in the debate. Why is this exclusive? Because your priorities will have to change to cater to the different needs of people who come out. We simply explained that if there's a trade-off on either side, the trade-off ought not be the most vulnerable individuals within the movement, but rather ones that are relatively more rich and able to make that decision in the first place. But as per the motion, you need to disincentivize being closeted, and therefore they cannot have this under their side, since then you're going to have a chicken and egg scenario where on one side you're saying you encourage people to come out, but on the other you're also supporting them by undertaking activities that allow for this sort of thing to happen in the first place. This is important because the standing deadlock at opening is where social movements create more change. This is unresolved and unlikely regardless because one, a far-right government indicates a revealed preference against gay individuals within the court. I disagree disagree with the frame that comes from opening opposition, but this argument works whether or not you believe that this does exist in just far-right economies or far-right societies in general, insofar as it explains how the movement is able to cater to and take care of the weakest within its society. But secondly, I also think incumbency advantage, the fact that you can frame wins within that election period as your own, means that these individuals will probably stay in these countries regardless. But also, you just skip a lot of the work and a lot of the mess that happens at opening. This argument is just a straight up good for the weakest members in this movement. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
I don't think outside opposition has to defend the movement pressurizing, but just merely like providing empowerment and choice.
Yeah, that's a problem, right? Because if it is true that you're not going to, if it's true that you encourage all of these individuals, all of the mechanisms of social change and acceptance rely on significantly large amounts of people inherently coming out. So if you don't do that and people are inherently scared, then you have to pressure them regardless anyways. But even if we explain that this debate regardless, and the actor that we're talking about is going to be harmed because the movement, by virtue of what it chooses to do, has to change its priorities away from these individuals in the comparative. This already wins us the debate for all the reasons illustrated already. The second extension is why this will manifest terribly. So let's fix the OG argument and engage in the world that is illustrated by opening opposition. Because I think the problem with the opening government argument of explaining why individuals will just come out willy-nilly is an explanation of the pervasive actions of how these movements will choose to do it. I think firstly, it's a lot of the things that we've already illustrated, that for the vast majority of their arguments to work, you'd have to believe that a significant amount of people will have to come out. But as per the observations of every other team in this round, if it is true that there are large disincentives for that to happen, it's unlikely why that's likely to change regardless. For all of these reasons, very, very proud to stand on closing government.
And with that, I would like to invite government to conclude the debate on site government here.
Am I audible and visible? Sorry, wait. Yeah.
You are now both audible and visible, I confirm.
Cool, thanks. I'll take POIs through chat. So if you ever have a POI, just do that. Or you can also just raise your hand on Zoom. Either is fine. Okay. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The idea of coming out itself will break down the queer movement. It will break down the communities that people felt and thought to be safe and make it even worse for the individuals who are left marginalized, only increasing the disparity between those with capacity to come out, between those with capacity to explain themselves. First thing I want to do in this speech is take out the brunt argumentation that comes from off-bench. Let's start with opening opposition. There's two broad questions I just want to intuitively ask. The first is, do people actually want it? And I want to note this is a crucial question that many movements need to ask but often don't. Do they want policies that rely on expressing their identity over being able to express it in the first place? The first observation I'd like to make is that policy goals under the comparative opposition change. And there are a vast majority of reasons why this is the case. Because people can come out, it's less incentive for them to use limited social capital that exists in far-right governments to fight for expression when the movement, as explained, like from opposition, can already do so in the first place. The problem is the same people that opening opposition identifies that self-preserve are isolated more. Those people who have no other option but not to come out because of the fear of loss of their life or the fear of loss of connection or the loss of support. They lose the urgency, they lose direction that is being able to dependent on coming out in the first place. And even if you could believe some magical world where maybe the world gets better in the long term, that still is harmful for individuals in the interim. People who are abused, people who are feeling unsafe and cannot opt into the queer movement at the point of which the complete direction and policy that they do fight for completely shifts away from being able to express and come out themselves and being able to not fight against discrimination, but rather towards broad arbitrary things that you aren't even sure people like, things like gay marriage and things that people individually don't want. The second is an intuition, right? If people don't want this, then all the harms occur of useless policy, you're wasting capital, and that in and of itself is economically and socially inefficient. But if people do want it, it leaves the people behind, which is why in and of itself, it's a terrible policy for you to opt in. But socially, it doesn't depend on you investing less into these things, right? It's just the broad idea that these things are more open, that queer communities that were perceived, that being perceived more means that otherwise tight knit and secret gatherings are now opened up. It's harder for you to opt into things in more anonymity. It's hard for you to opt into secret organizations and whatnot in order for you to express yourself when you feel unsafe. And the pressure itself to come out is the idea that otherwise you never feel the same happiness and political value as others. Maybe it's not directly compared to you. Maybe it's not direct investment taken away from you. The problem is that socially coming out itself changes that whole atmosphere of which people are able to interact with the queer community, and that in and of itself disenfranchises them for longer. That's why it's worse, and that's why even if economics isn't a problem, socially it is. The second question I want to ask is, can the movement direct this encouragement well? Because I want to know if OP relies on big buy-in. The issue is whether or not the ability for you to get people to come out and then actualize these ideas is able to be in the way that opening opposition explains it to be. Sam says three things. One, the difference in demographics that you cater to, that meant that you can't cater to all the people, and that by effect means you can't control the narrative for people who cannot opt into this. Secondly, that's often very personal and difficult. The exact reasons for why people don't want to come out is very different. And that insofar as that's true, the ways in which they interpret and internalize the idea that they need to come out is different individually. But lastly, intuitively, you just can't minutely control how people interpret it. The weighing on this is clear. You aren't sure that every single person who does come out will feel good about these things. You can't say that people who can't come out aren't pressured to do so or don't feel bad about these things. And that explicit flexibility with how people are able to interact with these things that are inherent to the idea and experience of the queer individual is something that means that it's hard for you to control that narrative in and of itself, and that it actively harms people when you force them to make a decision. Even if it is the idea of encouragement, it just locks them out from other options. But even if it was good and people did come out and that was generally a good idea, the problem is the ability for you to utilize the social capital is weak. External factors make it difficult for you to direct limited resources well. It's expensive. It's that people feel abandoned. It's likely that there's the actual marginal change that is just outweighed by the variety of harms that are given to you by both government teams. This response also extends to the idea of closing opposition. Well, we explained that, again, even if IR is better, and even if funding is better and support is better internationally, the question is, do people actually want the liberal Western interpretation of queer communities? To which we explain, many demographics can be described in status quo as being conservative, as having different cultural contexts, as having different contexts in general. And insofar as that's true, I'm unsure the weight of the reasoning as to why this funding is important for them and why these people individually access that agency that they want. But secondly, even if you didn't believe that and funding was good and abject, let's break down the feasibility for this. Why can't you believe their argument manifests in any actual counterfactual? Three things. One, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, what is the extent of funding, and is it actually enough to take people out of despondence? We explained to you that there might be a variety of reasons why this funding would be limited. It's self-interest of these queer movements that exist across the board. It is limited capital that exists by inherence, that it's hard to penetrate regimes and get propaganda and get NGOs to set up shop within these areas. But secondly, even if you believe you do get more funding, this isn't commensurate to the amount of support you give people for long-term development. You'd need to spend more on keeping people safe, on mitigating harms, and to say little actual money making lasting change that they want on their side. And the intuition for this is clear. It's that people think about donating to maybe war-driven countries in comparison to authoritarian governments, on investing in their own movements in comparison to other movements. Very clearly, they're likely to take the self-preservation, the self-interest, and that in and of itself proves to you why this capital is limited and often isn't enough to take these people out of despondence. But thirdly, then they say, well, we aren't reliant on this idea of big scale coming out, but say they want publicization in far-right governments who can control and silence the media and use propaganda. Very clearly, they are reliant on buy-in. They can't just say that. Lastly, how do we take out then our opening? We'd explained to you that Sam's argument is very clearly important over them for two reasons. One, for you to buy opening government's case, it is reliant on the belief that concealment is helpful, i.e., it is equally likely that a far-right government where you don't have rights is still harmful, even if it's comparatively less by a small amount on their opposition side, right? You see that your friends are harassed. You live in constant fear. There are microaggressions that still affect you, even if you're able to hide how it impacts you. That meant that safety isn't the metric for this debate, but rather our argument of being able to cater for people and making sure that they aren't left behind. Those who cannot come out, who need secrecy of the queer community, who rely on anonymity is more important in terms of impact, even if it's not as flashy as safety. But secondly, even in the best case, we assume why it's better for. It's that people don't want this, which wins us in charitability. We unlock the idea that comparatively it's just not unsafe, that's unlikely, but it disenfranchises queer people, and the ability for you to do these things in and of itself is harmful, not reliant on locking these people out. All of these reasons,